Not much arguing that the image of Portland has taken a hit over the past year and a half. With a spike in crime, a growing homeless crisis, and images of unrest and clashes downtown broadcast across the country. But how does Portland stack up against some other cities in the Pacific Northwest, like Seattle and San Francisco? Two Portland State University professors looked at the data for a better idea as the topic of this week's Willamette Week cover story. Joining us to talk about the article is Willamette Week news editor Aaron Mesh. Aaron, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you, Steve?
Not so bad, but you know, in this new book, Hunter Shoby and David Banis compare Portland to the others through a series of maps and visual data. Now, although legal in all three states, Portland overwhelmingly has more pot shops. What did they think was behind that trend?
It was one of the first things they noticed when they began looking at these maps. It popped out to them that it's nearly double the number of cannabis retailers in Portland, Oregon, compared to Seattle and San Francisco. And the reason isn't necessarily that Portlanders enjoy smoking cannabis more than residents of these other cities. It's because more licenses, more recreational licenses were made available by the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. So it's been much more restrictive in who can sell pot in other cities, whereas in Oregon, it's fairly wide open. It's almost a libertarian streak in the way that we handle regulation in this state. And it means that when you look at a map, you realize how many more options consumers have to buy weed.
Portland also stood out when it came to civil unrest following the death of George Floyd. How did it compare what was seen in Seattle and San Francisco?
I think what's really interesting is that if you look at the way that the protests progressed over the course of a year, initially Portland looked a lot like Seattle and San Francisco in its civil unrest, but San Francisco's protests died down fairly quickly. Seattle's were restricted in many ways to one region of the city, the Capitol Hill neighborhood, where an area called the Chaz or the Chop became an occupied location where activists sort of took over the street, but stayed restricted to one place. And in Portland, as you well know, for nearly more than 100 consecutive nights, there were confrontations between police and protesters, not just in downtown, but across the city. And I think one of the reasons why you see that is that the level of activist energy in this city, the level of confrontation and conflict between police and protesters, I think may be a little bit economic, that in Seattle and San Francisco, where business is king, things died down a little faster.
What comparison, Aaron, surprised you the most?
What stands out to me that every time I look at the economies of these three cities, it's a little bit shocking the degree to which Portland is outscaled, both in terms of how expensive it is, in terms of how much commerce comes through the airport, in terms of the educational attainment rate of citizens. San Francisco and Seattle are just bigger than us, more cosmopolitan than us. And in some ways, we remain a very raw, small Western town that is still figuring itself out in ways that the home of Amazon and Google certainly are not.
Aaron Mesh, always great to see you.
It's my pleasure.
Right, you can read the entire article in the latest edition of Willamette Week on newsstands now or online at wweek.com.